The year was 1929, when a group of scholars working within the dusty archives of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul stumbled upon something peculiar. Among the yellowed pages of forgotten manuscripts and court documents, they uncovered a fragment of a map unlike any other. It was drawn on a piece of gazelle skin, and though damaged, it bore a name in elaborate Ottoman Turkish script, Piri Reis, an admiral in the navy of the Ottoman Empire. He had completed the map in 1513. But what truly startled the researchers wasn't the age of the map or the name attached. It was what the map depicted. As we lean in closer with our mind's eye and picture this relic of another era, we see the familiar contours of the western coast of Africa and the eastern shores of South America. But then, our gaze drifts downward. Below the bulge of Brazil, Piri Reis's hand had sketched the outline of an icy continent, one that appeared startlingly similar to modern renderings of Antarctica. Not the Antarctica we know today, cloaked in thick layers of ice and mystery, but an Antarctica without ice, its coastlines fully visible. That moment, for many researchers, marked the beginning of a mystery that endures to this day. Because if the map did indeed show an ice-free Antarctica, then someone, long before the invention of satellites or even the voyages of Captain Cook, had not only found the southernmost continent, but had also mapped its coastline with stunning accuracy. And that someone must have done it thousands of years ago, when Antarctica's coast wasn't buried under miles of glacial ice. Piri Reis himself didn't claim to have discovered these lands firsthand. In notes on the map, he wrote that he had compiled it from around 20 older source maps, many of which he believed dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. These were not merely legends, they were navigational tools passed from one generation to another, until finally collated by an admiral curious about the boundaries of the known world. The story of this map forces us to confront an unsettling possibility, that someone, far in the forgotten corridors of history, possessed advanced knowledge of geography and seafaring far beyond what we once believed possible. We pause here, imagining Piri Reis himself, seated in his chamber in early 16th century Istanbul. Candles flicker along the stone walls. Rolls of parchment lie scattered around him. With a steady hand, he copies coastlines from ancient maps, some tattered, some ornate, and slowly assembles them into his own masterwork. What he does not know is that centuries later, people will gaze at this very skin of gazelle and ask, how? Some scholars were quick to dismiss the Antarctic resemblance. They suggested that what Piri Reis had drawn was simply the southernmost extension of South America, distorted by poor copying or limited geographical understanding. Others, however, pointed out the uncanny precision of the map in certain sections. The coastline, they argued, matched almost exactly with the true shape of Queen Maud Land, a portion of East Antarctica that wouldn't be officially discovered until the mid-20th century, and even then, only through sonar imaging beneath the ice. Even more curious was the absence of distortion. At a time when most maps showed warped coastlines and skewed proportions due to the lack of a reliable longitudinal reference system, Piri Reis's southern continent was proportionally sound. It matched, to a remarkable degree, modern seismic reconstructions of Antarctica's bedrock. And that is where the real mystery begins to deepen. Because according to geologists, Antarctica has been covered in thick ice for at least 6,000 years, and some estimates extend that figure well beyond 30,000 years. For any cartographer, Ottoman or otherwise, to have accurately drawn its ice-free coastline, they must have had access to source material far older than any known civilization. Some have proposed that the ancient Egyptians or Phoenicians might have reached the southern pole. Others speculate about even more mysterious origins. Could there have existed a civilization, now lost to time, with knowledge of navigation, astronomy, and map-making that rivaled or surpassed even our modern capabilities? We can almost imagine such a civilization, sailors moving silently across ancient seas in sleek vessels, astronomers charting the stars with tools of brass and wood, scholars drawing coastlines based on surveys taken from elevated cliffs, or perhaps even airborne platforms lost to history. Their maps, precious and few, passed down from hand to hand until finally reaching the admiral's table in Istanbul. There is a feeling that accompanies such musings, a quiet awe, not necessarily a rush to prove or disprove, but a deep respect for the riddle itself. Could we have missed an entire chapter of human achievement? Could these ancient maps be the surviving whispers of a forgotten age, echoing across time? As we close this section and drift a little deeper into the heart of our exploration, we hold on to one detail from the Piri Reis map. A line drawn with care, curling around a land that should not be visible, not in 1513, and certainly not without ice. And yet, there it is, a coastline rendered in ink on skin, waiting for someone, somewhere, to understand its true origin. When we return to the Piri Reis map and let our eyes settle on that curious landmass beneath the curve of South America, a new question begins to form. Could this truly be Antarctica, without its blanket of ice? The thought alone is enough to stir the imagination. But to even begin answering, we must step away from parchment and ink and venture instead into the cold science of geology. We know today that Antarctica is not merely icy. It is the most glaciated place on Earth, holding roughly 90% of the planet's freshwater ice. And this ice sheet, according to mainstream geological understanding, has been in place for at least 6,000 years, possibly much longer, perhaps even millions of years in some regions. So how could anyone, let alone a sailor in the 1500s, have drawn its ice-free coastline, a shape revealed only by modern technology? The detailed mapping of Antarctica's actual bedrock contours didn't begin until the 20th century, using seismic surveys and radar imaging to peer beneath the frozen layers. In particular, missions like Operation Deep Freeze in the 1950s and later NASA's BedMap projects used radar-equipped aircraft to map the land hidden beneath the miles of ice. And what they found stunned scientists. The coastline of Queen Maud Land, beneath the ice, matched that peculiar southern edge in the Piri Reis map nearly perfectly. Let's take a quiet moment to consider this. Two separate data points, one created with cutting-edge satellite and radar technology, the other drawn with ink on animal skin in the 16th century, both point to the same ice-free geography. That convergence cannot simply be brushed aside. Something extraordinary is at play here. Skeptics, of course, have offered alternative explanations. Some say that Piri Reis, or the cartographers he drew from, may have mistakenly connected the tip of South America with unknown southern lands, resulting in an accidental resemblance to Antarctica. Perhaps it was simply artistic interpretation or conjecture. Others argue the map's features are too vague to make any firm conclusions, and that our minds, eager for patterns, impose meaning where there is none. But the problem is that this kind of accidental precision seems to happen more than once, not just with Piri Reis, but with other ancient maps we'll encounter as we journey forward. And the more it happens, the less we can attribute it to coincidence. Returning to the question of ice, let's remember something crucial. If Antarctica was indeed ice-free at some point in our recent geological past, say within the last 10,000 years, it would mean that climate conditions were drastically different than we previously thought. That would challenge not only our understanding of ancient climate cycles, but also the timelines of human civilization. Most history books still claim that complex civilization didn't emerge until about 5,000 years ago, in Sumer or Egypt. But if someone had explored and mapped the ice-free Antarctic coast before then, it means either they came from a civilization we've never discovered, our timeline of Earth's climatic history is incorrect, or perhaps both are true. This mystery deepens when we consider the specific placement of the features on the Piri Reis map. The landmass sits not just in the general southern direction, but at the correct latitude. The curvature, the bays, and even certain mountain ranges align with eerie accuracy to modern radar images. It's as if whoever originally charted it did so from the air, something utterly impossible in the known ancient world. Let's drift even further back in time. What if, thousands of years ago, during a brief interglacial period or a local warming phase, parts of Antarctica's coastline were ice-free? Geologists have proposed that during the Eemian interglacial, about 120,000 years ago, global temperatures were warmer and sea levels were higher. Some small coastal regions of Antarctica may have been exposed. But the problem with this hypothesis is not just the time scale, it's the human presence. Homo sapiens were still hunter-gatherers at that time, and the idea of organized mapping, let alone polar navigation, seems unthinkable. Unless, again, we allow room for something else. A missing civilization, one lost not due to lack of achievement, but to time, tectonics, and tragedy. We imagine this now, a coastal outpost, once bustling with astronomers and sailors, long since swallowed by rising seas and shifting ice. Their instruments glinting in the sun, their navigators charting coastlines from sea and possibly sky. A civilization washed away, but leaving behind maps, the soft echoes of a world that might have once known far more than we do today. And what of those maps, passed down secretly through generations of scholars, guarded by monks, hidden in libraries, or carried eastward during the fall of Byzantium? Could they have made their way into the hands of Genoese merchants, Moorish astronomers, or perhaps even directly into the Ottoman court, where Piri Reis would eventually study them? There's something quietly thrilling in that idea, that the ancient world was not merely a dark age waiting to be enlightened, but a layered history of rises and falls, knowledge lost, and knowledge rediscovered. Perhaps we are only the most recent keepers of a flame passed between forgotten cities and sunken continents. We trace our fingers along that gazelle skin parchment one more time and whisper the question that lies at the heart of it all. If Antarctica was once mapped before the ice came, who held the compass? As we continue our quiet journey through time, we leave behind the Ottoman Empire and the gazelle skin parchment of Piri Reis. Our path now leads us into the mid-1500s, where another map emerges, one that adds to the haunting mystery of ancient cartographic knowledge. This is the Oronteus Finaeus map, drawn in 1531 and preserved today in the Library of Congress. And like the Piri Reis map, it whispers secrets of a world that should not have been known. The Oronteus Finaeus map, at first glance, is a masterpiece of Renaissance cartography. Named after its creator, a French mathematician and geographer, it reflects the growing curiosity of European scholars during the Age of Discovery. But when modern researchers began to examine the map more closely in the 20th century, a startling detail stood out. Once again, there it was, Antarctica. Not a vague suggestion of southern land, but a detailed and well-defined continent nestled at the bottom of the world. More remarkably, this Antarctica was shown without ice, its coastlines finely traced, rivers branching inland, and mountains lining its heart. No one in 1531 should have known what the land beneath the southern ice cap looked like. No expedition had ever traveled that far south. Even the very existence of Antarctica would not be officially confirmed until 1820, almost 3 centuries later. So, how did Oronteus Finaeus know? Let's drift gently into the map itself. We see a landmass aligned roughly where modern Antarctica lies, but the shape is far too accurate to dismiss. Along its edges are river systems, absent today under frozen wastelands, but plausible in a warmer age. There are mountain chains drawn with care, some of which astonishingly match the transantarctic mountains discovered only with aerial and seismic surveys. The mystery deepens when we consider how the land is centered correctly on the South Pole. Many early maps distorted southern regions due to projection errors, but here, the alignment is sound, and once again, the ice is missing. Could Oronteus Finaeus have, like Piri Reis, drawn from ancient sources, maps copied from copies, reaching back into the murky depths of forgotten history? In the 1960s, the cartographer Charles Hapgood brought new attention to the Oronteus Finaeus map. His theory, known as Earth crust displacement, proposed that Antarctica may have once been located in a more temperate zone, only shifting to its current polar position due to a dramatic geological event. Though Hapgood's theory was controversial and is not widely accepted in mainstream geology, it raised provocative questions. Could there have been a time when Antarctica was warm, habitable, and mapped by ancient humans? We imagine a civilization perched at the edge of such a land. Tall ships in ice-free harbors, cities hugging the coast, observatories pointed to southern stars. Their time came and went, erased by climate change, glacial advance, or the slow shifting of continents. And all that remains is a map, an inheritance passed through empires, arriving finally at a Renaissance desk in France. Or perhaps Oronteus Finaeus, like Piri Reis, did not fully understand what he was copying. Perhaps he too inherited scrolls or sea charts that had no known origin, preserved by scholars or navigators whose cultures had long vanished. In this view, he becomes not a cartographic innovator, but a careful curator of knowledge more ancient than even he could grasp. But what of the details? The rivers, the mountains? Could these have been imagined? It seems unlikely. Antarctica today is encased in up to 3 miles of ice. Its interior features were completely unknown to mapmakers of the 16th century. Yet many of those features appear on this map, not in speculative form, but with notable accuracy. And we, peering into this mystery, must ask once more, how? Some suggest satellite imagery was not the first method of viewing Earth from above. There are theories, wild to some, tantalizing to others, that ancient people might have used aerial platforms, perhaps hot air balloons, or some forgotten technology. Others claim that Atlantean seafarers, if they ever existed, might have sailed to the southern continent during a rare warm period, mapping what they saw before the Earth changed. We do not claim certainty, but we do allow ourselves the wonder, that quiet, growing awe that comes from looking at something that shouldn't be, and yet is. And even in the margins of the Oronteus Finaeus map, the hints persist. Labels such as Terra Australis, Southern Land, are written in Latin. But it is what lies beyond the words that captures us. The shadows of mountains, the riverbeds curling inland, the curvature of coastlines lost beneath frost for millennia. Modern science, equipped with radar and satellites, now sees what these ancient maps suggested long ago, and it raises a sobering possibility. These cartographers may not have been imagining or guessing. They may have been remembering. As we rest here, eyes half closed in thought, we allow our minds to picture them, those nameless explorers from a time long past, crossing oceans in ships made of timber and cloth, drawing the world not as myth, but as they truly saw it. They were cartographers of memory, etching the Earth's form onto fragile surfaces, trying to preserve what they knew before the snow returned. As we follow the delicate thread of ancient cartographic enigmas, it leads us toward another curious pattern, one that stretches across multiple maps and over several centuries. These are the Portolano charts, also known as Portolan maps. At first glance, they seem far removed from the Antarctic mysteries we've been exploring. They were used by sailors navigating the Mediterranean, Aegean, and Black Seas, worlds well known to classical and medieval cartographers. But when we linger and look closer, something stirs beneath their faded lines. These maps, appearing between the 13th and 16th centuries, possess a feature that continues to confound historians: remarkable accuracy. Coastlines are drawn with precision. Distances between ports are rendered correctly to within a few kilometers. Orientation is sound. Latitude is consistent. And all of this is done without modern instruments, without compasses, without sextants, and long before the age of satellites. The Portolano charts seem to come from nowhere. They are not evolutionary steps in map-making. They appear fully formed, as if copied from a master source that had already solved the puzzle of maritime geography. Most scholars agree that these maps could not have been constructed merely by dead reckoning or local knowledge. Something else was at work. Let's imagine one now. A Portolano chart spread across the wooden table of a 14th century Venetian navigator. It is filled with elaborate compass roses, radiating in delicate ink across the parchment. Networked rhumb lines, those straight lines used for sailing fixed compass courses, form a mesmerizing web across the seas. The coastlines of the Mediterranean, the Iberian Peninsula, and parts of North Africa appear with GPS-level clarity. Bays, inlets, and harbors are plotted not with guesswork, but with knowledge. How could medieval mariners have drawn with such fidelity? The logical answer might be centuries of sea travel, carefully compiled and refined. But this doesn't hold. Earlier maps from the same regions, especially those from classical antiquity, are far less accurate. There is no gradual improvement. There is only a leap, a sudden appearance of maps that seem far too modern for their time. Some historians suggest that these maps were built using coastal surveys, painstakingly conducted by mariners. But even then, the level of precision would have required a mathematical understanding of spherical trigonometry and accurate timekeeping, tools and concepts that did not yet exist. Others hypothesize the use of early compass readings and astronomical calculations, but the instruments to make these reliable readings were still in their infancy. And so a tantalizing idea emerges. What if these maps, like the Piri Reis and Oronteus Finaeus maps, were copies? What if they were not medieval inventions, but reproductions of much older charts, preserved across generations, their true origins lost? The theory of a source map begins to take shape. A master map or collection of charts, perhaps created by a civilization that no longer exists, may have served as the foundation. It would explain the sudden leap in cartographic sophistication. It would explain the strange consistency of the Portolano charts across regions and cultures. and it would explain how so many seafarers across time and geography navigated with such apparent confidence. Let's imagine this master map now, not as parchment, but as a legacy, passed from Phoenician traders to Roman surveyors, from Moorish scholars to Templar navigators, hidden in monasteries, whispered about in courtly academies, its pieces copied and fragmented until only traces remained, embedded in charts used by Portuguese and Spanish explorers centuries later. A few historians have dared to suggest that the precision of Portolano charts may imply knowledge of longitude, something thought impossible before the invention of the marine chronometer in the 18th century. Yet, here it is, quietly encoded in the gridwork of medieval maps. In 1971, historian Professor Arlington Mallory studied several of these charts and compared them to modern naval data. He found their errors to be so minimal that he concluded, though controversially, that they must have been based on much more advanced measurements. Mallory and others like him stood outside mainstream academic circles, but their observations refused to be silenced. So once again, we are left with the same quiet question. Where did this knowledge come from? Could it be that early cartographers were not, in fact, discovering new methods, but rediscovering something far older, something so deeply buried in the past that only shadows of it remain? When we trace our fingers across the lines of a Portolano chart, we feel more than ink. We feel the echo of unknown mariners, the careful work of mapmakers long forgotten, and perhaps even the last fading memories of a world we never truly knew. The maps are silent, but they speak in other ways. In their accuracy, in their consistency, in their refusal to fit the timeline we've written for them. They ask us to consider a radical idea. Not that ancient civilizations were like ours, but that some may have been ahead, not behind. That they glimpsed the world from heights we are only now beginning to rediscover. As we drift toward our next chapter, we hold on to that idea, that somewhere in the folds of history, there may have existed a people who knew the oceans like we know the sky, who mapped the earth as though they had seen it from the heavens. As our voyage continues across the sea of forgotten maps, we now arrive at a chart that quietly sits in a corner of European history, often overlooked and seldom mentioned, the Zeno Map. Attributed to two Venetian brothers, Niccolo and Antonio Zeno, the map was published in 1558 by a descendant, yet it tells a story rooted in the 1380s, predating Columbus and the Age of Discovery by more than a century. And what it shows is unsettling. The Zeno Map depicts a northern world unlike any that 14th century Venetians should have known. It shows Greenland not as an amorphous blob, but with curious detail. Even more striking, it includes islands in the Arctic Circle, some real, some seemingly lost to time. Among these are places like Friesland, Estotaland, and Icaria, names that have no firm place in today's geography, and yet appear again and again in other early maps. Let's hold this map in our imagination. Aged parchment, its ink gently faded, the contours of far northern lands stretching across the page. To those who study cartography, one detail stands out immediately. Greenland is shown as free from ice, with rivers and inlets carved into its shape, and a fragmented coastal outline that oddly resembles the Greenland revealed by satellite imaging today. For centuries, Greenland has been wrapped in a thick glacial blanket, its true shape hidden beneath layers of snow and ice. Only recently, with advanced radar mapping and satellite data, have we come to understand its rugged island-like structure. So, how, in the 14th century, did the Zeno brothers, or the source they copied, know? Skeptics have long labeled the Zeno Map a forgery or fantasy, perhaps invented to enhance the family's prestige. Some suggest that the brothers never even made their legendary northern journey, and that the map was drawn centuries later from imagination or scattered tales. But those who support its authenticity argue that such details, like the fjords and mountain ridges of Greenland, are too accurate to be guessed. Moreover, the Zeno Map includes parts of North America, referred to as Estotaland, long before Columbus's voyage in 1492. It places them north of Newfoundland, roughly corresponding to Labrador or Baffin Island. If accurate, this would suggest European awareness, or at least rumor, of lands across the Atlantic a full century before Columbus set sail. And then there are the Phantom Islands, Fryland, Icaria, and others, drawn clearly on the map but no longer found in our world. For some, they are evidence of error, mirages passed from map to map through repetition. But others suggest a more haunting possibility. Perhaps these islands once existed but were swallowed by the sea, or perhaps glacial melt and tectonic movement have erased their traces. We imagine now the Zeno brothers navigating strange northern waters in long boats borrowed from Norse mariners. Cold wind bites their skin. Glaciers loom in the distance, but further north they find unexpected warmth, open waters, temperate islands, and tales from local seafarers of even stranger lands across the horizon. They sketch what they hear, what they glimpse, what they are told. Their drawings are crude, but their vision is clear. The North was not unknown. It's worth noting that the Norse themselves had sailed to Greenland and even to the edges of North America, establishing outposts in Vinland around the year 1000. These facts, once dismissed as saga and myth, are now archaeological truth. Ruins found at Lanso Meadows, on Newfoundland, confirm Norse presence in the New World centuries before Columbus. So, the Zeno Map does not stand alone. It joins a quiet chorus of whispers, maps, legends, ruins, and relics, all pointing to a past that knew more than we assumed. Perhaps the Zeno brothers were not frauds, but preservers of something older. Perhaps their map was compiled not from personal exploration, but from scraps of maps far older than them, given by fishermen, monks, or navigators whose sources are now long lost. We notice another oddity in the Zeno Map. The polar regions are drawn with a peculiar four-island structure, separated by channels that converge into a central whirlpool. This vision of the North Pole recurs in later maps, most famously in the work of Gerardus Mercator, who we will visit soon. But it begins here, or perhaps before, and hints at a forgotten mythology, or even geography, of the high Arctic. This idea, that knowledge may have passed quietly through whispers and monasteries, coded in maps and stories, lingers with us as we drift from the Zeno Map. It teaches us that the past is rarely silent. It speaks through ink and compass lines, through forgotten coastlines and islands no longer seen. And so, we allow the Zeno Map to remain as it is, enigmatic, half-truth and half-memory. Whether it was crafted in Venice or passed down from unknown hands, it holds within its borders a glimpse of a world that may once have been vastly more connected, more explored than we ever imagined. In this twilight space between known and unknown, between Greenland's frozen mystery and the murmur of vanished islands, we feel the pulse of something older, something that calls to us still, across the folds of time and parchment. With the polar wind still brushing the edges of our imagination, we drift forward to another ancient mapmaker, one whose name still echoes through the halls of geography and exploration, Gerardus Mercator. Most of us know his name from the famous Mercator projection, a method of flattening the globe into a rectangular map that became standard for centuries. But fewer know that in the last map of his life, created in 1595, Mercator included something startling, something that suggests he too had access to knowledge the world had supposedly never known. This map, often overlooked in the shadow of his projection fame, was not simply a navigation tool, it was a vision of the Arctic, rendered with curious specificity. Mercator's drawing of the North Pole was unlike any modern depiction. Instead of a vast sheet of unbroken ice, it showed a large body of water surrounded by four massive landmasses, divided by rivers that flowed toward the center. And at the very heart of this formation lay a black magnetic rock, said to rise like a mountain from the sea. Rupes nigra, the Black Rock. It was a geography not just of space, but of myth. Yet it was drawn with the same care and precision Mercator had used to chart the real world. Where did this idea come from? Mercator's notes reference older maps, especially a now-lost account by a Franciscan friar named Jacobus Knoyen, who in turn cited the even older travels of a prince named Owain, who had reportedly ventured to the north in the 14th century. These reports, though passed down through manuscripts and oral tradition, were treated seriously enough by Mercator to be preserved in the most scholarly of settings. We picture his study now, lit by candlelight, the scent of parchment and ink in the air. Mercator, old and wise, tracing out rivers and mountains never confirmed by explorers, and yet believed. Not as fantasy, but as inherited truth. For him, cartography was not just science. It was memory, and sometimes memory defies logic. What draws us deeper into Mercator's polar vision is how consistent it is with other sources, many of which were unknown to each other. The Zeno Map, as we've seen, depicted the Arctic as a place with landmasses, rivers, and whirlpools. Earlier, Islamic and Chinese cartographers made similar allusions. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, dating back to 1300, also hints at mysterious islands surrounding the pole. Could it be, then, that these maps and myths share a common origin? A primal memory of the North before it was consumed by ice. Today, we know that the North Pole sits atop a shifting cap of sea ice, constantly moving and seasonally changing. There is no land beneath, only ocean. But under the broader Arctic region, there are islands, mountain ridges, and undersea trenches. And once, thousands of years ago, before the last glacial maximum solidified much of the polar zone, there may have been brief periods when sections of the Arctic were navigable and even hospitable. Some researchers have proposed that during these windows of warmer climate, perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 years ago, early seafarers might have reached these regions. If so, their knowledge would have been passed orally or recorded in materials that could not survive the ravages of ice and time. But fragments of that knowledge, like seeds in the wind, may have made their way into the hands of later civilizations. We pause here to consider something more poetic, that Mercator's Arctic is not simply a fantasy, but a memory map, a cartographic echo of a time long past. That the four islands around the pole, the channels between them, and the magnetic mountain at their heart were once more than symbols. They were real, or at least real enough to live on in the collective imagination of humanity. Even the idea of the magnetic mountain has curious resonance. Ancient stories from multiple cultures describe a powerful force at the top of the world. In Norse mythology, there is Hvergelmir, a cosmic spring beneath the root of the world tree, surrounded by icy rivers. In Hindu cosmology, Mount Meru serves as the axis mundi, the world axis, aligning heaven and earth. Even ancient Chinese texts describe Kunlun, a mythical mountain of immense spiritual power at the northern edge of the world. Mercator's black rock, Rupis nigra, may be another iteration of this ancient archetype, the axis, the pole, the hidden center. Not a physical object we can touch today, but a spiritual or energetic landmark remembered across civilizations. And what of the rivers, those great channels that flow from the center outward in a perfect cross? Might they reflect a symbolic geometry? Or could they, as some have speculated, correspond to actual undersea currents, like the Arctic's unique gyres and cold flows that move around the polar basin? Science dismisses the possibility of a central polar island, and yet there are anomalies, subsurface ridges, magnetic irregularities, strange compass behavior, and stories, always stories. As we move gently away from Mercator's map, we feel its quiet pull. Like a magnet of the mind, it draws us not toward proof, but toward possibility, that something once existed at the top of the world, whether land or legend, whether solid or symbolic, and that our ancestors remembered it. These ancient maps, layered with meaning and mystery, were not simply tools for navigation. They were stories, stories told in the language of coastlines and currents, stories that stretched across empires, across centuries, across minds. And in that tradition, we continue our own journey, listening to what they have to say, not with instruments and equations, but with wonder. For the maps may be old, but the questions they raise are forever young. In the quiet galleries of forgotten cartographers, there is one name that few recall, Philippe Buache, a French geographer whose 18th century maps once startled Europe. His most enigmatic creation, the Bauche map, unveiled a vision of Antarctica that, much like the Piri Reis and Oronteus Finaeus maps, defies the official narrative. But Buache's map is even more puzzling because it appears to show not one, but two Antarcticas, divided by a broad strait where today we find only frozen land. Drawn in 1737, the Buache map displays a split continent, two separate landmasses flanking a long water channel, aligned strikingly close to the Transantarctic Mountains, and what we now know as the Ross Sea. At the time, Antarctica had not yet been officially discovered. Its coastlines remained cloaked in mystery, and yet Buache charted them with uncanny precision, decades before explorers would even glimpse its icy shores. How could he have known? Buache was no mystic or wild theorist. He was the premier géographe du roi, the king's geographer of France, a man of science and mathematics. He believed strongly in what he called géographie conjecturale, or hypothetical geography. But But his hypotheses were not mere guesses. They were based on old texts, ancient maps, and logical deductions drawn from the flow of ocean currents and the structure of mountain ranges. He postulated that, beneath the ice, Antarctica was not a single solid mass, but two large islands separated by an open sea. At the time, this idea was dismissed, but with modern seismic data and radar mapping, we now know that he was, in essence, correct. Antarctica is not entirely unified beneath the ice. Its landmass is divided by deep rifts and channels, particularly in West Antarctica, where much of the ground lies below sea level. Let us take a moment to imagine Philippe Buache at work. His study is cluttered with scrolls and sketches, old seafarers' journals, classical texts from ancient Rome and Greece. He reads of Terra Australis, the great southern land believed by many philosophers to balance the continents of the north. He studies ocean currents and assumes, correctly, that large landmasses must be redirecting them in the south, but more than that. He consults sources long lost, perhaps maps inherited from explorers or scholars who had copied even older maps, like those once used by Piri Reis or Mercator. Bauche's map also hints at ancient memory. He labels parts of the southern continent as land seen by the Russians and land discovered by the Spaniards, despite the fact that neither nation had officially reported Antarctic landings. Did he have access to exploratory records now missing from history? Or was he working from charts passed secretly between courts and libraries, charts whose creators had long since vanished? And then there's the most mysterious feature, the Central Sea, bisecting the continent from east to west. At the time, the notion seemed absurd, but in recent years, satellite measurements have revealed vast subglacial lakes, including Lake Vostok, hidden under miles of ice. These lakes are not connected in a continuous sea, yet the presence of extensive water beneath the ice lends credibility to Buache's intuition. What if, long ago, before Antarctica froze, there truly had been such a strait? What if the ice sheet, over thousands of years, buried what was once navigable? Could ancient mariners, living in a warmer epoch, have passed between the two halves of the southern continent, recording their route in legends and charts that survived long enough to inspire Buache's educated guess? If such journeys occurred, they would have required sophisticated seafaring ability. And again, we're faced with that recurring suggestion that a civilization before the known civilizations may have existed, one capable of mapping coasts we've only recently rediscovered. But if we entertain this possibility, it means reshaping our view of history. It suggests that the Ice Age did not necessarily wipe the slate clean of intelligence and skill. Instead, it may have buried the evidence, leaving us only shadows, like the shape of a coastline beneath snow, or the curvature of a forgotten sea beneath ice. And still, skeptics urge caution. They argue that Buache's map was a fluke, a lucky prediction based on flawed assumptions. But how many flukes can we accept before the pattern becomes too compelling to ignore? The Bauche map joins a family of ancient and pre-modern maps that together create a mosaic of forbidden knowledge, a quiet legacy that whispers of explorers lost to time, civilizations erased by flood or frost, and memories transcribed into the language of coastlines and compass roses. As we step back and look once more at Buache's map, it feels less like a guess and more like a message in a bottle, cast into history's deep ocean and caught now by our curious hands. It asks not to be believed blindly, but to be considered with wonder. And perhaps that is the role of all ancient maps, not to prove, but to prompt, to nudge us toward forgotten doorways, to guide our curiosity like stars once guided ships. In the gentle contours of Buache's southern land, we glimpse the possibility of what once was and what may yet be found beneath the ice. As we continue unraveling this quiet cartographic tapestry, we leave behind the southern ice and drift eastward into a world of color, myth, and metaphysical precision. Our path now takes us deep into the ancient subcontinent of India, where geography, astronomy, and cosmology merged into a holistic understanding of the Earth long before Western science would formalize such knowledge. Here, maps were not just guides for the traveler, they were sacred reflections of the universe. Ancient Indian texts like the Puranas and the Surya Siddhanta, composed millennia ago, describe a cosmological structure known as Jambudvipa, the central landmass of the world. At first glance, this world seems symbolic or mythological, a mandala-like arrangement of concentric circles and mountain ranges. And yet, when examined more closely, this depiction of Earth harbors features that feel strikingly topographic. Jambudvapa is said to be surrounded by alternating rings of ocean and land, each vastly larger than the one before. At its center stands Mount Meru, the axis of the universe, described as a golden peak that connects heaven and earth. From Meru flow 4 great rivers, dividing the continent into 4 parts. The echoes of this geometry remind us of Mercator's North Pole vision, with its 4 islands and central magnetic mountain, similar patterns, separated by continents and centuries. But where Mercator's drawing was based on fragmented travelers' accounts, India's cosmography was deeply rooted in astronomical observation, mathematics, and spiritual metaphor. The Surya Siddhanta, written in Sanskrit more than 1,500 years ago, possibly based on earlier oral knowledge, describes the Earth as a sphere, gives remarkably accurate values for the Earth's diameter, and outlines celestial cycles with a level of precision that would not be matched in Europe until the Renaissance. Could these ancient sages have had access to advanced observational tools? Some scholars argue that the mathematics used in these texts imply an advanced understanding of trigonometry and timekeeping. The movements of the planets, lunar eclipses, solstices, and equinoxes, all were charted with meticulous care and used not just for ritual, but for structuring society itself. So, how does this relate to maps? In the ancient Indian worldview, space and time were inseparable, and cartography was not a distinct science, but woven into the rhythm of the cosmos. Pilgrims used yantras, sacred diagrams, both to orient themselves spiritually and to represent physical geography. Cities and temples were constructed according to Vastu Shastra, principles that aligned human structures with planetary and cosmic energies. The Mahabharata, one of India's great epics, includes descriptions of regions and kingdoms with such clarity and extent that some researchers have attempted to reconstruct geographic maps from it. When aligned with modern Indian geography, many of the descriptions surprisingly match known rivers, mountain ranges, and trade routes. And yet, it is the ancient cosmic maps that captivate the most, those that depict the world as a living organism, breathing with cycles of creation and destruction. In some interpretations, the rings of Jambudvapa represent not physical continents but layers of forgotten civilizations, expanding outward through time. Each ring is separated by water, possibly reflecting memories of catastrophic floods, like those that accompanied the end of the last ice age around 10,000 BCE. Could it be that these maps, far from fantasy, were compressed memories of an earlier age? That the sacred geometry reflected not imagination, but ancient observation, perhaps handed down from a civilization that lived and mapped during a time when the Earth's climate, sea levels, and coastlines were vastly different. In southern India, ancient rock carvings and temple reliefs display celestial charts that include star constellations visible only from southern latitudes, again raising questions about ancient navigation and global awareness. Some carvings even seem to depict eclipses and planetary alignments far in the past or future, suggesting a calendrical mastery beyond what should have been possible for the era. We imagine now a temple astronomer atop a stone observatory in ancient Ujjain, the meridian city of Indian timekeeping. He watches the stars with the naked eye, timing their transit with shadowed gnomons and water clocks. He inscribes what he sees into palm leaf manuscripts, into ritual, into poetry. His world is one where space is sacred, where every direction has meaning. His maps are not for war or commerce, but for harmony, with the earth, the cosmos, and the self. In such a world, to map the earth is not just to describe it, but to participate in its unfolding. The land is not static. It pulses, evolves, breathes. And in that vision, we see a different kind of ancient cartography, one that may preserve knowledge not only of geography, but of cosmic memory. The modern mind often divides myth from fact, story from science. But in the cosmographies of India, these lines blur. The shape of the world reflects the shape of thought. And through the mandalas of sacred geography, we glimpse something larger than cartographic technique. We see a living memory, encoded in symbols and starlight. As we drift on, the symmetry of Jambudvapa stays with us. Circles within circles, rivers flowing from the sacred mountain, oceans folding outward into eternity. Whether real or symbolic, it reminds us of an ancient impulse, to understand not just where we are, but who we are, in relation to the earth and the stars. Our path now leads further east, where scrolls of silk and ink await. The sun rises over mountains veiled in mist, and we enter the scholarly halls of ancient China. Here, cartography was not merely the work of travelers or traders. It was a state enterprise, a practice of governance, philosophy, and cosmic order. And among the maps preserved from this world, some shine with a light that surprises even modern historians. For within the intricate gridwork of Han Dynasty maps, a quiet mystery lies. The suggestion that a scientific understanding of space and scale existed long before its time. Let us pause in the year 113 CE, during the Eastern Han Dynasty, and unroll a document unearthed nearly 2 millennia later from a tomb in Mawangdui, Hunan province. This silk map, buried with a noblewoman, depicts regions of the Chinese Empire and beyond: rivers, mountain ranges, political boundaries. But what captures our attention is not merely the names or symbols, but the structure. The map is gridded, divided with clear rectangular blocks resembling latitude and longitude, centuries before this system was formalized in the West. This, some scholars argue, reflects a proto-Cartesian logic, using a reference framework to position places relative to one another. The Chinese called this lai, a measure of distance that adapted according to terrain and context. But what's more fascinating is that these early maps use scaling techniques that suggest an advanced understanding of projection, especially for a civilization that valued harmony over conquest. It was during the Qin and Han dynasties, between the 3rd century BCE and the 2nd century CE, that China began to develop what we now call scientific cartography. Officials created cadastral maps, land surveys used to allocate taxes and military resources based on large-scale measurements. But they also composed national maps known as yutu, or fish maps, so named for their often stylized shapes, which still maintain geographical coherence. These maps were not symbolic. They were practical tools, regularly updated and surprisingly precise. One astonishing example is the Pei Shu maps from the 3rd century CE. Pei Shu, a statesman and cartographer under the Western Jin dynasty, is often referred to as the father of Chinese cartography. He outlined 6 principles of mapmaking: scaling, measuring distances, correcting elevation, using a grid system, aligning direction, and detailing terrain. These principles remained in use for centuries. We imagine now a court cartographer seated in a bamboo-floored chamber, carefully tracing rivers and ridges onto silk using a calligraphy brush. He consults reports from surveyors, stares long into bronze mirrors etched with stars, and aligns his map with cardinal directions not only for accuracy, but to maintain harmony with the Tao, the natural order. In China, maps were never just geographic, they were also cosmological. The emperor, considered the son of heaven, ruled from the center of a universe in balance. To map the world was to reflect the sacred axis of the realm, and yet, for all their spiritual significance, these maps showed practical geography: trade routes, rivers, frontier zones, and foreign lands. Perhaps most surprising is that some early Chinese maps include regions far beyond what China was thought to know. The Da Ming Hun Yi Tu, a map from 1389, depicts Africa, Europe, and even parts of the Middle East, centuries before such global depictions became common in the West. Though not always perfectly scaled, the inclusion of these regions suggests that ancient Chinese scholars had access to knowledge far beyond their borders, possibly through Silk Road exchanges or even older traditions now lost. Could it be that maps like these, compiled from thousands of reports and fragments, preserved hints of ancient global knowledge, a cartographic lineage stretching back to earlier, forgotten times? Consider this. The Chinese navigators of the Zhenghe voyages in the early 1400s ventured across the Indian Ocean with massive ships, some longer than football fields, visiting lands as far as Africa. These expeditions required precise planning, awareness of coastlines, currents, and the open sea. And though most of their maps have not survived, accounts of their accuracy remain. Some fringe researchers suggest that Zhenghu's fleets and their predecessors may have inherited maps from even earlier navigators, ones whose reach and skill exceeded what we now consider possible. And if such maps ever existed, might they have included not only parts of the known world, but clues to lands long forgotten? Again, we do not claim certainty, but the question itself glows quietly in the parchment of time. Modern scientists have studied ancient Chinese maps and concluded that, while not accurate by satellite standards, their relative positioning of cities and rivers across thousands of miles was often startlingly consistent. Using only land measurements, chain-based surveys, and celestial alignment, these ancient geographers drew not just territories, but a worldview, ordered and vast. We leave this section with a reverent image, a map unrolled slowly by candlelight, its silk edges fraying, its brush strokes still alive. Along its winding rivers and mountain ranges are not just symbols, but remembrances, remnants of a world that once reached far, thought deeply, and captured it all in elegant curves of ink. Ancient China did not see the world as flat or disconnected, but as a network of meaning and terrain, where earth and heaven spoke the same language. And in that language, written softly in maps across centuries, we glimpse yet another reflection of forgotten wisdom. As we sift gently through these layers of history, our fingers tracing invisible borders across time, a larger pattern begins to emerge. We have seen maps from Ottoman admirals, Renaissance scholars, Han-era surveyors, and Hindu sages, all remarkably detailed, all whispering similar shapes of the earth. Now, a question takes form, one that has waited patiently behind each parchment and scroll. Could all these maps be fragments of something older, parts of a single, forgotten whole? This is the essence of the source map hypothesis, a theory proposed by researchers like Charles Hapgood, who believed that many ancient and pre-modern maps derived not from independent exploration, but from a common ancestral source, a master map, compiled during a time when Earth's coasts, islands, and continents were not yet obscured by ice or erased by time. Let us imagine such a map now, not in the form of any one document, but as an idea, an artifact of memory passed down through millennia. If it ever existed, it might have been created during a time when the world was in flux. The ending of the Ice Age, the rise of the sea, the fall of unknown cities whose names we'll never learn. Proponents of the hypothesis suggest that this master map, or series of maps, was created by a prehistoric seafaring civilization, possibly more advanced than any we recognize in the mainstream timeline. A culture skilled in astronomy, trigonometry, and oceanic navigation. One capable of mapping coastlines with surprising accuracy, and perhaps even the hidden contours beneath polar ice. And as that civilization faded, whether through climate catastrophe, war, or gradual decline, their knowledge was scattered like ash in the wind, preserved not in cities or monuments, but in fragments. A coastline remembered in a Phoenician scroll, a river system etched onto a Chinese silk map, a polar geometry passed down to Renaissance Europe through oral tradition or hidden libraries. Critics of this theory argue that there is no direct evidence of such a source map. No single surviving document bears its name. But perhaps that's precisely the point. A document can perish in fire or mold. A library can be lost in flood or war. What remains is what was copied, what was quoted, what was unknowingly preserved in derivative form. It's the consistencies across cultures that fuel the theory. How did 16th century Europeans chart parts of Antarctica's subglacial coast? How did medieval Portolano maps maintain such precise relative distances? How did ancient Indian and Chinese cosmographies encode planetary motion and spherical Earth models long before Copernicus? Hapgood pointed to maps like those of Oronteus Finaeus, Buache, and Piri Reis, noting their alignment with modern seismic data. He proposed that an advanced civilization, living before the last glaciation fully sealed Antarctica, may have surveyed the globe. Their knowledge, he believed, was handed down over generations, surfacing in the medieval and Renaissance eras not as innovation, but as recollection. We pause now and imagine a scene, a traveler from 12,000 years ago, gazing at the stars from a stone observatory near the sea. Around him are tools, simple yet precise. He charts the sun's angle, records the drift of constellations, notes the pull of the tides. His world is vast, but navigable. He draws coastlines not from imagination, but from experience. He belongs to a culture we no longer recognize, one not defined by pyramids or monuments, but by motion, across oceans, across generations. Is this fantasy, or is it memory? Even today, satellite imagery and bathymetric maps of Earth's seafloor continue to reveal curious alignments, sunken structures, land bridges, and formations that raise questions about what humans once knew. In places like the Dogger Bank in the North Sea, the Sundalen Shelf near Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean Basin, we find signs of lands that were once above water, teeming with life, possibly home to people who mapped, measured, and moved across them. The source map. Hypothesis does not ask us to believe in myth blindly. Instead, it invites us to consider that history is not linear. That knowledge is not always built from scratch, but sometimes recovered, partially understood, and passed along like a riddle with missing pieces. It's possible that each ancient or early map we've studied is a palimpsest, a layer upon a layer, where beneath the visible lies an older truth, half erased but not forgotten, a coastline drawn without knowing why, a mountain rendered in precise proportion, a landmass sketched from a source the artist could no longer name. And so, we return once again to the question, if there was once a master map, where did it come from? Who made it? And what became of the hands that drew it? Perhaps those hands belong to a civilization whose story is not told in textbooks, one whose cities now lie beneath the waves, whose knowledge lives on only in these fragments we've gathered, a civilization whose silence speaks through maps, coastlines, and quiet coincidences that refuse to fade. The source map. Hypothesis may never be confirmed with certainty, but in exploring its contours, we find something valuable, not just an alternative history, but a deeper appreciation for the maps we've inherited. They are not just records, they are echoes. And if we listen carefully, they may still be speaking. The whispers of maps, like waves lapping against forgotten shores, carry us now into the realm of legend. Beyond the inked coastlines and careful grids lies a possibility that has stirred human imagination for millennia. That there once existed a lost civilization, global in reach, steeped in knowledge, and gone long before the dawn of recorded history. Some call it Atlantis, others refer to it more broadly, a maritime people, seafarers from an age we no longer recall. Could they be the originators of the master maps? Let us begin with Plato, who first gave voice to the story of Atlantis in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE. According to his account, Atlantis was a mighty civilization located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. It was a land of wealth, technology, and spiritual insight, lost in a single day and night of catastrophic floods and earthquakes. For generations, scholars and skeptics alike have debated Plato's intent. Was he recounting a historical truth or constructing an allegory? Yet the timing he gave, placing the fall of Atlantis around 9,000 years before his own time, eerily aligns with the end of the last ice age, a time when sea levels rose dramatically, swallowing vast tracts of coastal land across the globe. It was during this same epoch that Antarctica may have briefly experienced an ice-free state, and when regions like Doggerland in the North Sea, Sundaland in Southeast Asia, and Beringia between Siberia and Alaska were above water. Could Atlantis have been one of many such places, advanced coastal civilizations erased by rising seas? Some believe the survivors of Atlantis, or similar lost cultures, became the seed-bearers of ancient knowledge, spreading across the world to Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and Mesoamerica. This idea, sometimes called the diffusionist theory, proposes that the sudden emergence of pyramid building, astronomy, and precise calendars in widely separated cultures points not to parallel invention, but to a common ancestral source. Imagine this. A ship arrives on a foreign shore. Its crew carries strange instruments, astrolabes, maps, coded star charts. They teach the locals to track the seasons, to read the stars, to measure the earth. Over time, their origins are forgotten. Their knowledge becomes myth, their names replaced by gods or sages in local lore. Yet the legacy remains, in temples aligned to solstices, in megaliths echoing the stars, and in maps that depict lands no longer visible. This idea is not new. It echoes in the works of Ignatius Donnelly, Graham Hancock, and others who have sought in myth and archaeology the evidence of a hidden chapter in human history. Though often dismissed by academic orthodoxy, their work compels us to ask, what if the myth is memory? Indeed, indigenous oral traditions around the world speak of great floods and sunken lands. The Hopi of North America, the Dogon of West Africa, the Maori of New Zealand, and the Aboriginal peoples of Australia All tell stories of ancient cataclysms, of star people, of ancestors who came from across the sea. These stories, when compared side by side, resemble pieces of a larger puzzle. And among the most compelling pieces is the sailing knowledge of ancient peoples. The Polynesians navigated across thousands of miles of open ocean without modern tools, using only stars, swells, and bird behavior. The Phoenicians, long before the Greeks, sailed beyond the known world. The Sea Peoples, shrouded in mystery, wreaked havoc across the Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age collapse. Who were they? Where did they come from? Could there have been a time, before Egypt, before Sumer, when the oceans were highways rather than barriers? When knowledge passed from port to port, written not on papyrus, but etched into the minds of mariners and kept alive in the precision of ancient maps? Consider the Piri Reis map once more. If it contains portions of a master map, then those fragments had to survive for thousands of years through wars, plagues, and the fall of empires. They would have had to be cherished, copied with reverence, hidden in monasteries, or stored in secret collections. Their survival hints not just at their value, but at a lineage of knowledge, quietly carried through time by those who refused to let it vanish. And so, we return to Atlantis, not necessarily the shining island described by Plato, but as a symbol, a placeholder for a civilization that might have once walked among the stars and coastlines, whose memory echoes in every unexplained detail on ancient maps. These possibilities need not clash with science. They invite it to listen more deeply. Beneath the sand, beneath the sea, beneath the assumptions we take for granted, lies a past that still speaks, in fragments, in folklore, in the cartographer's careful hand. Let us walk the final stretch of this journey with eyes open, not to answers, but to wonder. For if we are indeed the descendants of a lost people, if our maps are not inventions but inheritances, then we carry their legacy not just in geography, but in our endless curiosity, a yearning to rediscover what they once knew. We now come to the final fold in this long and quiet journey, our last step across the landscapes of parchment, possibility, and memory. As we settle into this final chapter, we return not to the maps themselves, but to the feeling they leave behind, the soft ache of wonder, the gentle tug of unanswered questions, the glimmering thread of something ancient and unresolved. The maps we've explored, the Piri Reis, Oronteus Finaeus, Zeno, Mercator, and Buache, each tell stories not just of geography, but of human persistence. They hint at voyages across oceans before history was written, at civilizations that may have glimpsed the shape of the earth with clarity we can hardly explain. They do not shout their truths, but whisper them, and if we lean close enough, we begin to hear. We've walked with Hindu sages, studied with Han Dynasty scholars, watched French geographers split the Antarctic ice with pen and compass. We've imagined seafarers of deep antiquity tracing coastlines later buried beneath rising seas. And now, we find ourselves surrounded by these silent cartographic echoes, all pointing to the same quiet possibility, that we may not have been first. It is a humbling thought, and also a comforting one, because it reminds us that knowledge is not linear. It can rise, fall, vanish, and return. It is passed on, hidden, rediscovered, not always in words, but sometimes in the curves of a coastline, the angle of a mountain range, or a forgotten island on a fading chart. We picture a map now, not one held in museums, but one that exists between memory and myth, a parchment half lit by candlelight, with coastlines that no longer exist, rivers now buried, and names written in scripts no longer spoken. Its corners are frayed, its origin unknown, and yet its message endures. There was more to the world than we are taught, more to history than we have recorded, more to ourselves than we remember. In the final light of this journey, we allow ourselves to believe, not blindly, but bravely, that perhaps human history is deeper, more layered, and more mysterious than we imagined, that the maps left behind are not mistakes, but memories. As our minds soften into stillness, we picture the earth from far above, oceans glimmering in moonlight, continents like breathing creatures, and threads of ancient travel routes winding invisibly across the surface. Somewhere out there, lost beneath sand or sea or snow, may lie more maps, more knowledge, more voices waiting to be heard again. And perhaps the final truth is this, that we too are map makers, that we draw our own lines across time, searching for meaning, connection, origin, that in our quietest hours, we are not only explorers, but rememberers, carrying a torch passed to us through whispers of ink, starlight, and story. So now we rest. We leave the compass on the table. We let the maps curl back into scrolls, and we listen to the sound of wind brushing against forgotten sails, to the waves that once carried knowledge across lost seas, to the breath of time, slow and steady, cradling a planet that still holds secrets. Let this final moment linger like dust drifting through ancient halls. We do not need to know everything to be filled with wonder.